Good morning. Thank you all for joining us for another installment of the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation's COVID-19 Economic Implications webinar series.
Thank you, Shane. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us all again. We hope that you and your loved ones and professional colleagues are all faring well during this pandemic, and we appreciate you checking in with us each week for updated information on the impacts the pandemic is having on our regional economy and those who make their livelihoods from it. It's a very important part of our mission at the LAEDC, which is advancing opportunity and prosperity for all. One of the ways we do that is trying to inform us all on how this economy is faring in good times and bad so that we can all make more informed decisions as individuals, as public policymakers, as entrepreneurs, owners, or operators of businesses in the region. And so we're grateful for the time you're sharing with us. We've promised to make each of these a half hour in length so we can respect your time. And I'll get quickly into a couple of updates from my end and then introduce one of my colleagues from our LAEDC Institute for Applied Economics to share with you the latest information we've gathered for you. This is the fifth in our series of weekly updates for you from the LAEDC Institute. You've heard us during the first four sessions share a great deal of information about the scope and scale of the economic disruption that we've all been experiencing. Numbers of layoffs and furloughs continue to climb in our county, across our state, the nation, and the world. In just March and April, more than 3.6 million Californians have filed initial claims for unemployment. That's as of the week ended April 25. This coming Friday, we'll get the report through the end of April, and we project that layoffs and furloughs will continue in the weeks ahead, although likely at a moderating rate, as they have since the peak week for claims in California during the week ended April 4, when more than 1 million initial claims for unemployment were filed. In a prior webinar, I pointed out to you our concern that California was not getting its fair share of the SBA's Paycheck Protection Program loan dollars during the first round of that program. At one point, I think when about 200 billion of the 350 billion had been accounted for, California was only getting about 8.4% of those loan dollars, despite the fact that we represent about 12% of the nation's population. Knowing that, we redoubled our outreach at the LAEDC and with many partners throughout the region to ensure that our small businesses were ready to apply, that there were sufficient financial institutions ready to take their applications. And we also advocated strongly that there be carve-outs in the second round of dollars and the addition of more credit unions and more community development financial institutions, CDFIs, so as to get to our smaller businesses, our micro enterprises, even our community-serving nonprofits. And I do know that Senator Feinstein rattled some cages back in Washington as well. And as a result, in the latter half of the first round of PPP, California did much better at one point, reaching, I think, nearly 10% of the allocated capital. I'm happy to tell you that in the second round, we're faring even better. It's important that we share with you how this is going, and you will hear it from my colleague in our institute, because these two programs account for about $660 billion of federal relief capital. These are loans, a good deal of which may be forgiven, which becomes effectively a grant to our smallest businesses and nonprofits. And it is designed to help them stem the tide of layoffs and furloughs or bring back employees who have previously been laid off or furloughed. So it's important that we get our fair share across this state because our state economy is very large and the economic impacts have been very large on our state. We're also well aware that folks are getting more frustrated by having to stay home and keep their businesses shuttered the longer the stay-at-home orders remain in place. We Angelenos have done a remarkably good job of respecting and adhering to the social distancing orders issued here in Los Angeles County and from our state. And all of us at the LAEDC hope that we continue to do so throughout this month of May. I believe we will hear good news from our governor in the coming days about phased reopenings of certain sectors of our economy. I would caution that LA County may lag a bit behind smaller counties in our state on this reopening process because we currently account for nearly half of all the confirmed cases of COVID-19 in our state and more than half of the deaths, despite our population representing only 1/4 of the state's population. We're also still ramping up our testing capabilities here to have a better picture of just how many of us have been infected by the virus, and to be able to protect people in certain industries who may need to be tested before they can get back to certain workplaces. Fortunately, our county supervisors have decided to form a recovery and resiliency task force, and they are making calls this week to populate that task force, which will likely include representatives of each of the major industry sectors impacted by the pandemic-related safety orders to date. We've advised the county that it's important that we get word to our employers throughout our region as quickly as possible as to what will be expected of them to be allowed to reopen, so they will have the necessary time to acquire the necessary equipment or specific cleaning supplies, or the time to reconfigure their work sites to maximize the safety of their employees and of their customers if they're a customer-facing business. I suspect we will hear more details on the reopening process this month and could see certain sectors reopening in Los Angeles County in June. However, reopenings will be limited, at first to the sectors that can most safely reopen, and perhaps there'll be limits on occupation in restaurants or other venues, which will lead to a slow recovery in certain sectors. There'll be a constant monitoring process to see if there are any undue spikes happening in the case count. And if there are not, there'll be additional restrictions lifted until we can get more of our economy back and humming again. Even with the stay-at-home orders in place, we're seeing good news for some of our employers in the region. Just in the last couple of days, it was announced that Aerojet Rocketdyne received a $1.8 billion contract from NASA to build rocket engines for the space program here in the San Fernando Valley. And that's exciting news. And we hope to have more exciting news like that to share with you in the days, weeks, and months ahead. The light is visible at the end of the tunnel. There will be reopening. Smart people at the federal, state, and local levels are planning that course, and they are engaging with private sector leaders from our region at all those levels. Federal, state, and local task forces have a lot of very bright people from the Los Angeles County region participating in the planning of how to reopen and how to support the reopenings of different sectors. You'll hear us talking more about that in the weeks to come. But today, I do want you to hear some of the details about this SBA PPP program, and I think you'll also hear about the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, the EIDL program, because both of them have brought billions of dollars to our region. But I'll let my colleague Tyler LaFerriere, who's the Associate Economist in our Institute for Applied Economics, give you the specific good news. Thanks again for joining us. Look forward to having a few minutes to answer any questions after Tyler's presentation. Tyler, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everyone. As Bill said, my name is Tyler LaFerriere, and I'm an associate economist with the Institute for Applied Economics at the LAEDC. Shannon Sedgwick, our beloved director, asked that I provide this week's economic implications and your briefing this week, but she will be back with you next week to cover some of the fiscal implications of COVID-19 in the county and for the 88 cities. For those of you who I have met, and for those of you I have not had the pleasure of meeting, I hope you, your loved ones, and your colleagues are keeping well and safe as we continue to collectively face down this pandemic. And if you're a Star Wars fan like myself, happy May the 4th. This week, we wanted to offer some perspective on the status of several federal efforts that offer relief to small businesses, namely the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, EIDL program, and the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, and how we estimate these programs have impacted the state of California and Los Angeles County. Many of the data concerning these programs are still being produced and released for our assessment. So this briefing represents the best information we have to date on these programs. As we learn more, we will be sharing those analyses through this and other media with you. As has been our custom each week on these webinars, we wanted to reflect quickly on the status of COVID-19 in LA County. As of May 1st, when this slide was created, there were almost 23,800 cases confirmed in the county. That was raised today to over 25,600 cases. This accounts for over 46% of the cases in the state, the largest share of any county. And LA County has experienced over 50% of the COVID-related deaths statewide. As you can see, it appears the curve may be flattening, but it is not yet flat. So it is still contingent upon us to observe the measures taken by state and local governments to fight this pandemic. Taking brief stock of the pandemic's toll on employment, over 3.6 million Californians have applied for unemployment relief since the first week of March. However, you can see the number of new claims has steadily fallen since the end of last month. Though each new claim represents a struggling Californian family, the data indicate a downward trend in additional employment displacement due to COVID-related business closures. With those updates, we can now begin our discussion about the impacts and implications of the federal government's efforts to provide financial relief to America's and California's small businesses. Businesses with fewer than 500 employees, used by the SBA, the Small Business Administration, to define small businesses for loan efforts, employ over 53% of LA County residents. Businesses with fewer than 20 employees, which make up the majority of small businesses in LA County, employ roughly a quarter of county residents. As such, we have attempted to determine how effective these efforts have been in providing aid to our businesses. To provide context, it will help to briefly examine the scope of small business in LA County. Overall, 93% of county businesses employ fewer than 20 people. Indeed, 87% of LA businesses are defined as micro businesses or enterprises, employing fewer than 10 employees. Most industries in the county are dominated by small businesses with fewer than 500 employees, and over 50% of small businesses in LA County are members of some of the industries with the largest amount of employment in the county: professional services, healthcare, retail trade, hospitality, which is also known as accommodation and food service, and wholesale trade. As you can see, small business is key to all of our industries, so small business relief efforts are key to the entire LA economy. In its relief efforts, the Small Business Administration has relied on two major tools, the EIDL and the PPP. The EIDL funds have since been exhausted since the beginning of this crisis, and the program is no longer accepting new applications, though applications that were submitted before the end of April are still being processed. As has been well publicized, the PPP has been provided a second round of funding from Congress as of the third week of April, meaning this program is still accepting applications. This slide shows the major differences between the programs. The first being that the EIDL is a direct loan from the government and is not facilitated by a third-party depository institution. Unlike the PPP, it cannot be forgiven. The PPP, by contrast, is still ongoing in its second iteration, but thus far has over half of its appropriated funding been issued. Briefly examining the EIDL, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, California businesses were the top beneficiaries among the 50 states in terms of the $10,000 advances that were available to businesses through the program, taking well and above all other states their share of advances in terms of the number of loans and dollars. California received $726 million in advances, followed by Texas, which received $412 million in advances. To give context for this and later slides, California is home to over 12.5% of the nation's small businesses, and 12% of Americans employed by small business are Californians. The same is even more true of EID loans, with almost a quarter of loans issued and loan dollars going to Californian businesses. California received almost $1.9 billion in these loans, followed by Florida with $540.3 million loans. Turning our attention to PPP, the SBA has reported that as of April 27th, 112,967 PPP loans were processed for California, worth over $33 billion in value. This comes second to Texas, which received over 134,000 loans, but California still ranks first in terms of loan dollars allocated, receiving over $5 billion more than the Lone Star State. Per capita, the Sun Belt states, both in the West and South, appear underserved compared to the Midwest and Northeast, at least in the first round of PPP funds, which this map represents. The first half of the second round of PPP appears to have been allocated similarly, with California's per capita allocation being $840 per Californian in this second round. This compares in both cases with a state like North Dakota, which received over $2,000 per capita in PPP funds. Loans have also varied markedly by industry. By gross dollars, the construction industry has been the largest net recipient. By number of loans, the professional service industry has been the top net recipient. Average loan size also varies markedly by industry. Management companies have received the largest average size loans, while firms in agriculture, fishing, and forestry have received the smallest on average. In attempting to assess the net benefit to California and LA businesses from PPP, it is useful to compare the top recipients of loans by amount and number of loans by industry. As you can see, the top beneficiary industries nationally largely mirror the top 5 industries in the state and county as measured by number of firms when we look at the number of PPP loans. The exception is the construction industry, and this is also true if we measure things by employment. The discrepancy is larger when we consider that manufacturing and construction have received among the most PPP dollars. However, both of these industries are still essential state and county industries by employment and output. If the state distribution of recipients echoes the nation-level distribution of PPP recipients, both the state and county businesses are still benefiting. The first round of PPP, worth, as Bill mentioned, $350 billion, ended April 16th, though applications were still being processed. The second round, $310 billion, have been operational as of late April, and this round is still ongoing. So far, California has received more from PPP Round 2 in terms of loans and gross loan dollars than PPP Round 1. As was indicated previously, PPP Round 2 loans have been smaller on average and therefore in greater quantity, with over 90% valued at less than $150,000. The proportion of loans by dollar amount is also more broadly distributed, but you can see that it is even in terms of dollar amounts that PPP Round 2 loans are still smaller on average, with nearly 37% of dollars in Phase 1 awarded through loans valued at less than $150,000 compared to 17% with nearly 37% of dollars in Phase 2 awarded through loans valued at less than $150,000 compared with 17% in Phase 1. To conclude, California has been a top recipient of EIDL and PPP relief. There appears to be some mismatch, however, by industry between PPP recipients nationally and top industries by a number of firms in California and LA County. However, California has appeared to benefit proportionately more from the second round of PPP than the first. Much remains uncertain in terms of the eventual outcomes of these relief programs, specifically, and the impact of the economic shutdowns generally. We have received many questions about timelines and scope for recovery, and the simple, if perhaps unsatisfactory answer is that we're still learning day by day, week by week. It is difficult to tell how consumer and business behavior will change in the longer term at this moment. Evidence from other countries and regions that have remained fairly open, like Sweden, or those that have reopened, like Singapore and Hong Kong, indicate that consumer activity remains cautious even in the context of widespread testing and tracking. However, you can rest assured that we at the Institute and at the LAEDC as a whole are watching, studying, and analyzing every trend we can, and we are ready to share our findings with you as soon as we can. Thank you for being with us today for today's briefing, and Bill and I will now take your questions.
Thank you both, Bill and Tyler, for your presentation today and sharing. We've had a lot of questions come in over this last week, and a good handful of those questions have focused on the loan forgiveness amount and exactly what the requirements of the PPP are. How will the loan forgiveness amount be calculated? And then the wording on the 75% of payroll section is a little bit confusing. Would I need to maintain all of my employees to make sure the loan is forgiven? And what happens if a couple of the employees have gotten jobs since we closed?
This is a pretty common question. The reality is many companies did lay off some folks who got work elsewhere and may not come back to that company. But I don't believe that precludes the companies from receiving the loan nor having a portion of it forgiven. What appears to be most important is that the loan amount was calculated on 2.5 months of your average payroll in the preceding 12 months, and that you spend at least 75% of the loan amount that you get on payroll. So it depends. If you lost 2 out of 100 employees, it's probably not going to be a problem for you to be able to keep 75% of what you're spending on payroll. If you lost more than a quarter of your folks, then maybe it could put at risk some element of the forgivability. We're not experts on the legal aspects of this at the LAEDC, so one would be well advised to reach out to any of the, or even do a simple internet search of any of the accounting firms and law firms that have published some analyses and interpretation of these rules. But our understanding is you have several options. One is if you had 2 of your 10 employees that were laid off go get work elsewhere, you could bring 2 new employees back on so that you'd be able to capture the full amount of the forgivable payroll element of the PPP loan. On the other hand, as I say, you might still be able to spend 75% of what you got on payroll, and that's what's required for having a forgiveness. And perhaps the forgiveness amount will be reduced by some amount from the 100% based on your spending. But it's not clear to us that if you had a couple of your employees, if you had 20 or 30 employees move on, that you couldn't get any portion of the loan forgiven.
My understanding doesn't deviate from Bill's. I would simply add that one of our chief internal criticisms is that the 8 weeks was pegged at the loan's origination rather than the start of the various shutdowns imposed by the various states and municipalities. And so that's been one of our concerns, and concerns expressed to us by our members and by small businesses that we've interacted with, that there was something of a mismatch between what the law and the loan stipulated, the conditions of the loan stipulated, versus what the actual need of businesses were.
Next question we have, and Tyler, I'll have you start this one. Have you run projections on how unemployment levels will change over time given various dates when stay-at-home will be lifted or eased?
Well, since our context is LA and California, right now neither the governor nor mayor have committed concretely to any sort of opening up date. And even when they do commit to a date to lift a lot of the stay-at-home orders and to begin reopening a lot of our businesses, one of the problems is being able to then determine what sort of restrictions those businesses are under in order to be opening. As Bill and Shannon have mentioned over the course of these last several weeks, businesses, especially food service establishments, cinemas, gyms, all sorts of different sort of public-facing businesses related to leisure are going to be under different requirements through time. Restaurants may only be able to be at 25% occupancy, and even then only offer table service, not bar service. So that will then change how many people that they keep on staff, both front of house and back of house. This will be true of cinemas, this will be true of gyms, this will be true of a lot of personal service related businesses. So part of that complicates making future projections concrete. Again, as I mentioned in my remarks, we also don't know how radically and how deeply consumer or business behavior has changed as a result of these lockdowns. As I mentioned, other countries that have remained fairly open or have returned to being open have still witnessed a radical decline in consumer sentiment. And even before a lot of the shutdowns, we saw consumers really draw back in terms of their outward facing and non-home based consumption. Airbnb witnessed a radical decline even before a lot of shutdowns in terms of reservations. OpenTable witnessed a radical decline, I think on par of 90% in terms of restaurant reservations. So even if businesses start to reopen moderately, consumers may still be very hesitant or may not even have the capital at home to be able to consume as they once did because a lot of them lost their jobs. So that just complicates making any concrete projections on our part.
Well said.
Another question we have that did come in. Are you seeing a disproportional impact within the Hispanic small business community?
What I will say is that based upon some of our profiling in earlier iterations of these briefings of small businesses, what we've seen is that the Hispanic community and most communities of color have a disproportionate ownership of a lot of the businesses that suffered the most in terms of food service, accommodation, establishments, personal services, which that's anywhere from auto mechanics to at-home care to hair salons, to nail salons, establishments like that. In addition, retail and wholesale trade were disproportionately affected and were disproportionately owned by communities of color. So we can say concretely that even without specific numbers, that unfortunately our Hispanic community and most of our communities of color have been disproportionately affected by a lot of these shutdowns and a lot of these restrictions on businesses.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. We've been pretty consistent in expressing our concern about the disproportionate impacts on our low-income communities and communities of color. We've seen here in LA County over the weekend, the public health director talked about the disproportionate health impacts on the Black community, the Native American community, the Asian Pacific Islander community. But we also know from prior research we've shared with you in prior weeks that our low-income communities of color tend to operate many of the businesses that have been impacted by this virus, and they also happen to be relatively undercapitalized compared to businesses owned by white non-Hispanic entrepreneurs. And so with limited capital to withstand this, a heavy representation in these affected industries, they are suffering greatly. And it's why we have worked so hard with multilingual technical assistance specialists on our staff and added to our staff in the last few weeks to try and connect as many of these businesses, particularly micro enterprises and community serving nonprofits in our communities of color, to these loan programs. And I'll also share that the County of Los Angeles has already offered, I think, one loan program and an access portal to a PPP window they had set up with Goldman Sachs, are also working on additional loan programs. They're working with the philanthropic community, they're working with their own resources, and they're working with financial institutions to try and stand up some additional relief capital that would be targeted at low-income communities of color, micro enterprises, and community-serving nonprofits. And I hope that in the next week there'll be some announcement, and perhaps within 2 weeks that loan program will be available. We're going to need additional capital as this drags on.
Excellent. Well, thank you both, Tyler and Bill. That is all the time we do have for today. We do ask that everybody joins us next week for our next installment of these economic implications webinars. Or as Tyler had mentioned earlier, it will be on the fiscal impact. Please email us any additional questions you may have at shane.cullen@laedc.org. You'll see that on your screen now. We also recommend you utilize the resources on the LAEDC COVID-19 response page, which can be found at laedc.org/coronavirus, which you can also see on the screen. We hope you will join us next week on Monday, May 11th at 11 a.m. for the next webinar. Thank you all very much and have a great week.
Thank you, everyone. Be well.